Good evening and welcome to tonight's edition of Tysky Sour. I'm Michael Walker and as ever, I'm joined by Aaron Bastani. How are you doing, Aaron? Can we get Aaron in there? Oh, I think we might have lost him.
I'm here.
Momentarily.
We've got
you there.
I've been unmuted. How you doing, Michael? You good?
Fabulous. And your face has appeared. Me and Aaron are going to be talking later in the show about Boris Johnson's first appearance in the government press conferences for over a month now. He's been hinting towards what Britain's exit strategy will look like. We're also going to talk about the controversial issue of Keir Starmer shifting Labour's position on Kashmir. First, though, we're going to speak to Vincent Bevins, who's joining us from Sao Paulo. Is that right?
Yep, I'm in Sao Paulo. Hello.
Hey, Vincent is a journalist who often writes for NY Mag, New York Magazine, and you've also got a book on Indonesia coming out, right?
Yeah, a book on anti-communist violence across the world, including Brazil. So it's helped to understand what's going on.
And today we're going to talk about Bolsonaro's response to coronavirus, which, I mean, to my mind, seems like one of the, he seems like one of the global leaders who has reacted most poorly to this global pandemic. So that is, we'll get into whether or not Vincent thinks that's actually the case as we go through the show. First of all, you're watching Tysky Sour. As you know, we want to get more people watching this feed. So please tweet on the hashtag Tysky Sour and share the link. Let's start introducing Bolsonaro, Brazil, and COVID-19. So in Brazil, at the moment, officially, there are around 5,500 deaths from COVID-19. Half of those are in Sao Paulo, where Vincent is joining us from. So obviously that's a significant figure, but it's a fraction of what we're currently seeing in the UK, up to 45,000 deaths in Britain. I want to bring in Vincent and ask, is this a case of undercounting? So the fact that, it's only 5,500 in Brazil compared to the at least 25,000 here, potentially up to 45,000. Is that in Brazil they're undercounting deaths, or is it that Brazil and South America in general has just been hit less hard than Europe? How big a problem is coronavirus where you are?
It's not that we've been hit less hard, but we've been hit later, and that the deaths are undercounted. So that 5,000 number is too low. The real number is going to be higher, but also it's important to realize that we're one of the few countries in the world that's still, the curve is still going up, right? So we're still accumulating contagion very quickly, and it's likely to get worse, and we're about to see the public health system overwhelmed very quickly as well.
I think actually we can get that graphic up, can't we, Fox?
Yeah, the FT
where Brazil is at its current stage. So you can see it's sort of up there. In terms of countries outside of Europe and North America, it's the highest. I want to move us quite quickly on to talking about Bolsonaro. We'll talk about the more general situation, but he's a good place to start, partly because, I mean, it's obviously a macabre subject, but he's quite entertaining. So I want to show a clip of Bolsonaro earlier in March. And so a big theme of Bolsonaro's approach to coronavirus is he has talked it down. He said it's not a particularly significant problem. This is him saying why he thinks he won't be under any threat from coronavirus.
Particular, pelo meu histórico de atleta, caso fosse contaminado pelo vírus, não precisaria me preocupar. Nada sentiria ou seria, quando muito, acometido de uma gripezinha.
So in case you're listening on the podcast and couldn't see the subtitles, that was Bolsonaro saying that that coronavirus for him will only be like a little cold because he was an athlete when he was younger. This dismissive approach might explain why he has been so ostentatiously flouting social distancing rules, and also why he has displayed a fairly callous approach or response to the people who have died from coronavirus. This is him responding earlier in the week to a question about the rising death toll.
A gente ultrapassou o número de mortes da China. O Brasil não vai.
Lamento. Quer que faça o quê? Eu sou Messias, mas não faço milagre.
Again, if you're listening to the podcast, Bolsonaro was asked for his comments on the increasing death toll. He said, "So what? I mourn. What do you want me to do? I'm called Messias," which is a reference to his surname, which means Messiah in Portuguese, but I can't perform miracles. Vincent, how is this going down? I mean, I know he was always supposed to be a divisive politician. Are there some people, are the what do you call them, Bolsonaristas?
Yeah, Bolsonaristas. Yeah.
Bolsonaristas, are they sort of, following in his footsteps in sort of saying this virus is nothing to worry about and having a dismissive attitude, or has he, found himself out of step
Well,
with the popular
the
movement?
thing about the real Bolsonaristas is that they don't really care what happens in the exterior world. So the real core of Bolsonaro support, the Bolsonaristas, as I say, is about 20-25% of the country, and they're very unlikely to abandon him, even no matter what happens. And he's had a really bad couple of weeks, losing his two key ministers, who being accused of serious crimes. Now the Supreme Court blocking his appointment to the federal police. So he's against the ropes. But the thing about Bolsonarismo, the actual core support, is that they're not likely to drop no matter what happens. And going back to that first clip, it's funny because he phrased it as a hypothetical, right? He's like, well, if I were to get it, I would be fine. But I think a quite credible theory that a lot of people hold on to here is that he did have it, and that's exactly why he thinks it's not a big deal, is because for him, it wasn't that bad. So I was actually in Congress doing some interviews with some core members of the Bolsonaro political movement when we found out that he had come back from Mar-a-Lago in Florida, and that most of the people on the plane with him had been tested positive for coronavirus. And then he got tested, and then he refused to release his results, and then the courts ordered him to release his results, and he hasn't. So a pretty decent guess is that he had it. It didn't kill him, and so he thought, oh, well, it's fine. But his approach in general to the pandemic, while, as I said, it doesn't really carve into his support with the core far-right support that made his presidency possible, it's definitely not going over well with the sort of business class or the well-to-do, well-informed elites in Rio and Sao Paulo that were also part of the coalition that gave him political power. So this is definitely a transformative moment for him. It's not looking very good. He's made a lot of bets, as he always does. He always bets, and he always bets big. Up until this point, he's always won, but it's not looking good now.
Let's look at one of the bets he's made, which is that he can side with the anti-lockdown movement. I suppose he's probably kind of trying to lead it. This is another clip of Bolsonaro sort of leading an anti-lockdown protest.
Porque acredito em vocês! Vocês estão aqui porque acreditam no Brasil! Nós não queremos negociar nada! Nós queremos ação pelo Brasil!
I mean, there are a lot of parallels with the United States and Brazil in terms of coronavirus, and I suppose also the political system. You've got a president who seems fairly careless or reckless when it comes to coronavirus, but that has been mediated by state governors who are able to implement of their own accord lockdowns, and that has sort of been a bit of a savior for public safety, that you have this intermediary level of government. But that protest there looked a lot bigger than the anti-lockdown protests I've seen in the United States. So I was wondering, how impactful has the anti-lockdown movement been? How often are you seeing big crowds in Brazil where everyone could just be spreading coronavirus between them?
Pretty often, consistently. So we had them here before Trump supporters had them in the United States, but I think it's worth pointing out that protest, if I'm not mistaken, is actually a protest calling for the abolition of Congress and the Supreme Court. That is the protest calling for the end of democracy in Brazil. So it does not only upset whatever members of the moderate middle classes that might have supported him that he's showing up at any protest. These are protests meant to destroy Brazilian democracy. And Bolsonaro, his 30-year political career has been about the fact that he thinks democracy was a bad idea, and he thinks that the dictatorship should have killed more leftists, and we need to get rid of the left forever if South America is going to be saved. But there was a lot of people that told themselves that wasn't important anymore. The business class, international investors, the elites in Rio and Sao Paulo that preferred him to the Workers' Party. And the two protests that he showed up at, not only going against his health minister, who had said not to gather in the streets, not to contact people physically, but also affirming his support once more for the end of democracy, is causing real problems amongst the so-called moderates in in his previous coalition. So if he comes out of the next few weeks, and if you want, we can talk about the loss of his 2 ministers. If he survives 6 months, 12 months into the future, it will not be with the same coalition that he entered government with. This is a transformative moment. I think it's the most likely is that he leaves power. He's either impeached or forced out in the next year or two. Another is that he kind of just muddles through as the military deep state, as his movement might call it, governs for him, and he's sort of just tweeting to his followers and has no real power. Or, and this has been the dream for a long time, although I think it's increasingly unlikely, is that they seize power in a sort of coup, and then they do get, sweep aside Brazilian democratic institutions. So it's certainly an exciting time to be locked in this fight in Sao Paulo, but things won't stay the same for sure over the next few weeks.
I mean, that's super interesting. That's this, there's another sort of comparison there with the United States, right? Whereas, Bolsonaro, he's another populist figure where he's, doesn't necessarily reflect the views of the ruling class, but they've sort of seen them as someone they can use. They can put them up as a political figurehead that basically just implements neoliberalism whilst talking about something else. And it seems like this coronavirus crisis was something that those elites didn't foresee happening. Now they're having second thoughts, and that's presumably the context in which we should see the firing of the health minister, but now the resignation of the justice minister, and moves to basically indict Bolsonaro. So it seems quite plausible that he could be impeached and brought from power.
Yeah, that's right. And he might lose the neoliberals, right? So he is not a neoliberal. He doesn't care. He cares about destroying the left and wiping them off the face of the earth. Heavy state intervention in the economy, no state in the economy, bad economy, good. He doesn't know, he doesn't care. So perhaps it would be helpful to sort of outline what alliances he did make to take power and sort of analyze which he's losing, which he could hold on to. So Bolsonarismo in itself, that core support for him is easiest to understand as just a fascist movement, right? So it's mostly the middle classes, but not the real elite. So, petty bourgeoisie and like the old Marxist terminology, mostly men, and they don't care about any of those other things. They like him. They don't like democracy. They want to crush the left, crush the poor if necessary, but of course, pretend they're on the side of the poor. But that Bolsonarismo could not, that's only 25% of the country. So in order to take power, they made a series of alliances. And so the first one is the neoliberal business class, as I said. So the key bridge between Bolsonarismo and that class is his finance minister, Paulo Guedes, who's a Chicago boy, a fan of Pinochet, a real neoliberal. He really believes it. He came into power hoping that he would fix Brazil by getting rid of the state. Then you had the alliance with the military. So while Bolsonaro pretends to be a military man, he isn't really. 10 years ago, the military didn't like him. He was essentially forced out of the military for agitating for higher wages, maybe planning a bombing that was going to be a false flag operation that would justify a more power to his aspect of his sort of level of the military. But in recent years, he made a real attempt to make an alliance with the high command of the military and put loads of them in positions of power. And his vice president, very importantly, is an actual general. He's not anything. He used to be a captain, but he's nothing. And then you have the anti-corruption crusade, the Lava Jato anti-corruption movement. And this created its own sort of political constituency over the last 4 to 5 years. And it was led by a judge named Sergio Moro, who ran a crusading, ambitious, rules be damned, laws be damned, attempts to get rid of corruption in Brazilian politics. But if we look back on it 5 years later, those that were skeptical about its real motives turned out to be correct. It turns out they were really concerned with getting the left out of power. And very few people would argue now that we have a less corrupt country than we did at the time. And then also you have some parts of the working class. If you were at the polls doing interviews when Bolsonaro was elected, as I was, you had a lot of regular people that don't really support Bolsonaro or what he stands for, and they're not fascist, and they voted for Lula, but they're like, let's try something new. I heard the Workers' Party screwed things up. So in the last 2 weeks, you've seen 2 out of those 4 alliances badly shaken, right? So when Health Minister Mandetta resigned, basically because of Bolsonaro's sort of screw everything anti-science position on coronavirus, and we can try to explain why he took that position, but he ended up taking that position, and among democratically elected leaders in the world, he probably is the worst. You probably, I think the only one who's really worst is the leader of Belarus, who is not, does not really.
I don't know about that guy. What's he done?
Well, he just says it's not real at all, but he has no, it's not a democracy at all. He has no accountability to his people. So when Bolsonaro lost Mandetta, and the way that he acted during the arrival of the coronavirus, he really shook the foundations of his alliance with, let's say, the neoliberal bourgeoisie, right? So Paulo Guedes could go, the Chicago boy finance minister that I said is at the core of this bridge. But even if he stays, it looks like he's lost power to a sort of military deep state, which is upping state intervention in the economy. And then on Friday, Sergio Moro, who is this crusading white knight of the anti-politics, anti-corruption movement that grew up in Brazil in the last 5 years, he quit in very dramatic fashion, accusing Bolsonaro of interfering in the federal police. Everybody understood that the reason he would do that is to protect his two sons from very serious investigations which are underway. And then in the last 48 hours, the Supreme Court has blocked the new appointment to the federal police. And the best way to summarize this up is that his alliances are falling apart. So, and he's in survival mode. He's on the defensive. But it's very possible, and this happens all the time in Brazilian politics, that he'll be on the defensive for 6 months or a year or 18 months. But he is now in the sort of positioning that will increase his chances of surviving, not really of carrying out any kind of an agenda, whether it be neoliberal or anti-left or what have you.
I mean, obviously, this is probably the prime example in the world of a sort of, well, traditional is potentially an odd word to use, but it's a crisis among the institutions and
right.
Of coalitions breaking down and different parts of the state finding themselves in conflict with one another. And how is that intersecting with the coronavirus crisis? Because, so if you think about the United Kingdom, we've got people who are locked down, people who are locked in their homes, and the state has kind of, they've fucked up a lot, but they've also had to step up to sort of provide income support, et cetera, et cetera. In Brazil, if everything's breaking down in the middle of a global pandemic, how are those two crises intersecting?
So yeah, one of those three options that I laid out, Bolsonaro just being sort of isolated in the presidential palace and tweeting and not really governing the country, that's kind of what's been happening on the coronavirus question. And this may have been the reason that he took such a radically anti-science position in the first place. He was already at war with Congress and Supreme Court and certain state governors before the pandemic arrived. And when the pandemic did arrive, some of his former allies, conservative governors in Sao Paulo and Rio, immediately took action and put in place social isolation measures, did sort of the internationally recognized best practices. And this possibly, one theory would propose, that this is what really led him to react so violently as an anti-science guy, is that these two guys in powerful states are challenging my authority, and so none of it's real. I'm going to blame them for all of the economic repercussions of the pandemic. I'm going to say that it's not the coronavirus which is ruining the economy. It's these two governors that are refusing to recognize my authority. And this works to some extent. So recent polling has shown that some part of that working class constituency that voted for him because, I voted for Lula, maybe Bolsonaro is going to help me. Some part of that constituency does think that he is fighting to save their paycheck, whereas his political enemies are the ones that are forcing them to stay home because of this power struggle. Of course, if you look a little bit closer, it's actually Bolsonaro's leadership in the Congress, which is stopping financial help from getting to people on the ground that need it. But that's the line that's been drawn, is that Bolsonaro is going to pretend that it's his political enemies that are causing the economic crisis. And his political enemies, who of course have their own ambitions, and I think Sergio Moro has his own ambitions too, are taking the other line where, no, we're really governing the country. Bolsonaro is the madman in the castle tweeting, and we're going to save the public health system, which is one of the biggest in the world. It is like a NHS style system, and it basically works, but we're very close to the point where it could be overcome. And that curve is still rising, and everybody thinks that Bolsonaro going on TV and going around the backs of local leaders and saying, ignore them, rebel, work, have a party, whatever. Doing that is the patriotic thing to do is part of the reason why our curve is still ascending.
Final question for you, and then we're going to go to our madman in the castle, which is, I suppose, concretely, what is the level of social support that's being given to workers and families in lockdown? And if it is low, could we see, a genuine upswell of support for breaking the lockdown? And if some old people die, go for it. Do you know what I mean? Because even in this country, there are people saying the lockdown is too expensive, we have to end it. But in a country without a proper safety net of the extent that we've got here, I can imagine that it's almost easier to make that argument. Yeah,
and so they got 600 reais. So that's like 100 pounds once, and most people have had a hard time getting it.
So that's a one-off payment.
Yeah, one-off payment. And there is some kind of, if you have a full-time job here, there is some kind of automatic unemployment benefits that step in to kick in. But I think in general, as you go across the world, the less developed a country is, the harder it is to support a population staying out of work for a long time. And you got these, like I said, both of these two opposing camps, both hoping for a different version of terribleness, because, the right-wing governors, if there's a health crisis, that proves them right. And if Bolsonaro sees the economy collapse, then that proves him right. So there's not really a good way going forward. But I think you're absolutely right. I think that the pressure is mounting and something is going to give on either side.
Well, that's a good actually place to end, because there's something giving on the other side is when we'll get you back on. Actually, to briefly clarify, what do you mean by something's got to give on either side? What's going to? What do we see now? What's going to happen?
Either the lockdown will be very difficult to maintain because people are running out of food, literally starving, and there's people without food, or in a couple days the health system will collapse in such a spectacular and obvious manner that people won't want to go back to work because they're afraid of being one of those people lying on the ground in a dirty hallway, dying because they can't get a ventilator.
Wow, very grim. Vincent, thank you so much for joining us on the show this evening. I'm sure we'll definitely get you back. Actually, how long are you going to be in Sao Paulo for?
I don't know. I wasn't.
You don't know. You weren't supposed to be there.
I was supposed to be back in London by now, but everything that I was going to do has been canceled because of coronavirus. So I'll stay a few more weeks and then probably try to make my way back to London when things slow down. Okay. Thanks a lot.
Well, we'll speak to you again. Good night.
Thanks.
Or good afternoon. Aaron, can we get Aaron Bastani back in?
I'm here, Michael. What a great guest.
Yeah, what a great guest. I mean, what is going on in Brazil does sound, phenomenal. It feels chaotic here, and politics is moving so fast, but that's all with a stable government with a stable majority, kind of, very little tension. Our opposition isn't even bothering to do any opposition whatsoever. And in other countries, you've got a potential impeachment program, which is going to be coming up.
I mean, we've had our institutions as they are for 350 years. Brazil's had its institutions for 35 years.
True. Right, you're watching Navarra Media, you're watching Tiski Sour. We want more people watching this live show, so share the show link and tweet on the hashtag Tiski Sour. And most importantly, in fact, subscribe to this channel. If you're watching this, if you're enjoying what you're seeing, and you want to see more, make sure you hit that subscribe button. The first story me and Aaron are going to talk about is Boris Johnson's first press conference since coming back from a month off because of his suffering from coronavirus and ending up in critical care. And then yesterday, him having his 6th or 7th child. A topic which we covered in more depth yesterday, we only really covered the media response to it, which was at times ridiculous. In that press conference, it became apparent that government advisors and scientists had saved Boris Johnson some good news.
And so I can confirm today that for the first time, we are past the peak of this disease. We're past the peak and we're on the downward slope.
So, that's good news. Great. It's good that we're past the peak. It is, I just thought it was kind of funny seeing that and him being given that line after a month. Because let's look at the slides they show in these government briefings. So we can look at admissions first. So you can see that we peaked about 2 weeks ago, right? Go to patients, people who are currently in ICU. We peaked at about the 10th of April. People in critical care. Again, we peaked at about the 10th of April, and then deaths peaked sort of, well, the highest death toll was sort of, again, the 10th of April, but it peaked a bit later than that. So, I mean, this is obviously all good news. It's great. It's great that the peak happened as early as it did. It wasn't particularly early. Obviously, we've got one of the highest death tolls in Europe, but it just, I think, shows how much of a PR stunt these press conferences can be, that there is obviously no scientific justification for announcing that the peak is over now, except to give Boris Johnson a great headline on BBC for his first appearance back. Let's go to his next line, which is a bit more substantive before going to Aaron. So this was obviously also the first opportunity Boris had to stand up in public and give his assessment of how Britain's response to coronavirus has been. Yeah, let's look at that.
We've so far succeeded in the first and most important task we set ourselves as a nation, to avoid the tragedy that engulfed other parts of the world. Because at no stage has our NHS been overwhelmed. No patient went without a ventilator. No patient was deprived of intensive care. We have 5 of the 7 projected Nightingale wards. And it's thanks to that massive collective effort to shield the NHS that we avoided an uncontrollable and catastrophic epidemic, where the reasonable worst case scenario was 500,000 deaths.
So, I mean, it's
crazy.
I mean, it just does seem quite cynical to, at this point in time, talk about the 500,000 deaths. So before the epidemic, you know, before the worst moment had hit, they told us that 20,000 was going to be a good result. That's what Patrick Vallance said. And then after 45,000 people died, they said, oh well, at least it wasn't 500,000. You know, it seems a bit like you're moving the bar to try and make sure you always go underneath it.
Well, actually, Chris Whitty, I believe, maybe March 12th, 13th, when he went to do the Today programme, he explicitly said herd immunity would mean 60 to 80% of people get it.
That was Vallance, but
sorry,
Vallance was the more vocal one.
So yeah, the number, yes, there were the numbers, but that was also, you know, that has to be confirmed. But that was actually the government strategy, right? Which would have been circa 200,000 people. So Boris Johnson says 500,000 people would have been a tragedy, and yet the insinuation from earlier behaviour and statements is that actually 250,000 was the government plan. Now, at what point does 250,000 be business as usual, become 500,000? That's a tragedy. What's the tipping point? 350,000? But also just the comparison of us to other countries. I mean, just mind blowing. I mean, we're repeating ourselves frequently saying this stuff, but we don't have a functioning media. How can we have the highest well, outside of Italy, the highest death toll in Europe right now? We're probably going to overtake Italy. Right now, we're the 3rd highest in the world death toll. How can you say that we're outperforming other countries? It's crazy.
Yeah, the idea that we avoided a tragedy which happened elsewhere. This was brought up by Robert Peston, partly because, you know, the government shows in every day at these press conferences the global comparisons, which we can get up now, I think, which does show, since we have started to include care home deaths and deaths outside of hospital, which Italy and France were doing all along, that's shown that we are on a higher trajectory than our European neighbours. Only the USA is on a higher trajectory. Obviously, they have a much larger population. So that led Robert Peston to ask Boris Johnson if he had learned anything, if the fact that Britain had potentially the highest death toll in Europe had meant that he would reassess the government strategy up to now. The answer Boris Johnson gave was one that we've heard from many government ministers and even government scientists who, you know, at times seem to be covering for those government ministers. He said it's very difficult to compare. It's difficult to compare across countries until next year or the year after, or until, you know, the issue is until the heat has gone out of the issue, and obviously he'll be under less scrutiny and pressure. But then he did go on to make his own comparisons.
Actually, I think that the only real test, the only real comparison is going to be possible at the end of the epidemic when you look at total excess deaths. And I'll ask Chris or Patrick to say a bit about that. And so I genuinely think, when I look back at what the UK has done, I think that, and by the way, when we put in the lockdown, it was earlier in the curve of our epidemic than it was, relatively speaking, in France and Italy and Spain. You know, I think we did the right measures at the right time.
So what we've seen with many of the other government ministers in these press conferences and from the scientists is lots of evasion. We often hear them evading the question and trying to ignore it and giving vague answers which don't really commit them to much. Now we've got Boris Johnson returned. What we're seeing is outright lies, right? So what Boris Johnson said there was that Britain shut down its economy at an earlier stage in the epidemic curve than France, Italy, and Spain. That's not true. Let's get up the actual lockdown dates and number of deaths when each of these countries entered into a lockdown. This is how we should judge at what point in the epidemic curve they were at. So Italy was the first to lock down on the 9th of March. They had 463 deaths at that point. In Spain, the 15th of March with 288 deaths. In France, the 16th of March with 148 deaths. In the UK, the 24th of March with 335 deaths. So you can see there that Spain and France, they both entered a lockdown earlier in terms of dates than us, and they also went into lockdown earlier in terms of the number of deaths. I've put Germany down there to show what a good response to coronavirus is, which is they locked down on the 15th of March with only 11 deaths. So we're seeing complete untruths from Boris Johnson there. Do you think he's going to get away with this? I mean, because there is a difference between evading a question and just standing up and outright lying in front of the country.
Yeah, it's just a blatant lie. It's a blatant mistruth. But what we have to remember is this a man who has spent his life specializing in lies and mistruths. And it's not, you know, what's really frightening about that clip is that he's not just evading the question. You know, he's not trying to put a certain spin on things. It's an outright brazen lie. And there is going to be probably a judge-led inquiry into this. There will be books written about this. And by the way, we're only like an 1/8 or a 10th of the way through this thing. There could be a second peak. The idea that you know, this, we've gone through the peak. We've gone through the peak. It's not some natural phenomenon. That's contingent on how the government has responded. If we now proceed to make bad decisions again, like the bad decisions we saw after February and March, we could have a much higher peak again. So it's just completely detached from reality. In the short term, do I think the media is going to call him out on it? Not really. In the longer term, when this stuff is being chronicled, documented by the historians, and when I say historians, I mean, you know, books will be written on the coronavirus and they'll be out in 2 years. When these things are talked about in historical documentaries and so on, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, making sense of this stuff. You know, I think Boris Johnson will be villainized even more than Tony Blair was with regards to Iraq. And I don't say that lightly. But I think it's a good analog, because if you think about public sentiment when we first invaded Iraq, actually there was slightly more consent for intervention in Iraq once we actually did it. And I think that so far, the fact we're right in the middle of this thing is blunting a lot of the criticism towards Boris Johnson, rightly or wrongly. And that's why Keir Starmer's pursuing that line of thinking. But I think within a year or two, people will look at that clip and things like it and think, wow, this guy is completely deranged and deluded.
It's quite an interesting phenomenon where, you know, the public support for Boris Johnson and the government is quite high. But the public are also saying, you know, obviously we went into a lockdown too late. So polls are showing there's a massive majority who think that we were way too late to go into a lockdown. And that's clearly one of the reasons why we've had such a high death toll, even though we had all of that warning. But the government and their PR people have obviously decided they can't admit that. None of their scientists are willing to admit that. So there's this bizarre facade where sort of everyone knows they made this mistake back in March, but no one wants to admit it. And I'm not sure do you think the government would be in a better position if they just admitted they'd made a mistake? Or do you think that the reason they are not admitting it is because they think that so long as it's not spelt out in black and white, they can evade responsibility and sort of leave this element of doubt, which should be enough for some people to give them the benefit of the doubt on this question.
Well, look, we're only, like I say, we're only slightly through this. And it may be that the British response to coronavirus going forward is much better than it's been so far. They throw more money at it. They're far more cautious in regards to, ending a lockdown and so on. And in a year or two, when we come out the other end of this, or 3 or 4 years, or whatever it may be that Britain has far fewer casualties than many other countries, at which point they can say, we did a great job. But I think at this point, I don't think they would want to admit any of that, because they want the conclusions as to their response when they are written in a couple of years' time, 18 months from now, let's say. They want to tell a very different story to where we presently are. And they may be able to author a slightly different story. So I can see why you would do that. Obviously, don't agree with it. I think it's deplorable. I think, frankly, the government should be, we're not going to have a general election under these circumstances, but I think you should have a change of prime minister. My goodness, we've had 45,000 people die. And it's not just the 45,000 people, it's the PPE as well. If we ended a lockdown now, he's saying we didn't break the NHS. That's precisely what would happen immediately. We haven't got the PPE to protect NHS staff. Care workers are going into 1 care home, 2 care homes, 3 care homes, and they weren't wearing any protective kit. They were almost like biological weapons walking into care homes. So I can see why they won't concede to that truth. But it's very hard to imagine them doing such a great job in the next 18 months, which would be so at odds with the previous several months, because it would just require an ideological volte-face. It would require basic competence, which they've not demonstrated so far.
There's two issues, isn't there? Because the herd immunity strategy was like, we might get more deaths earlier, but that will mean that we get out of it later. And then you could have said, that's what Sweden is saying. They're saying, look, come back later in the year and maybe we'll be better off than these other countries. But the government can't have their cake and eat it. They can't both say we're not going for herd immunity and say potentially us putting off the lockdown for 2 weeks was a good idea. The two things are completely inconsistent. I want us to move on to exit strategies. And to be fair, I feel like, what Boris Johnson is saying here is less egregious than what he was saying back in March. It does seem like he has at least woken up to the seriousness of coronavirus. I want to start with, I think it was a first in this press conference where the government had put forward a sort of officially mandated explainer video, which was, it was an animation that was telling us or explaining the theory of the reproduction rate of COVID-19, why it's so important, and how it will be used to judge when and how lockdown can be loosened.
Scientists around the world have been tracking the R of coronavirus since the start of the outbreak. In March, at its peak, R was around 3, which seems to be the natural rate for this virus. Since then, thanks to you and the social distancing measures you followed, we've been able to reduce R, and it is now below 1. But we've only just passed the peak of the virus, and it's vital R stays below 1. Over the coming weeks and months, the government will be monitoring R very carefully. It will be a key factor in how social distancing measures are used in the future.
So that's them explaining the concept of R, the reproduction rate of coronavirus. If R is 1, that means that every person who has coronavirus, they pass it on to 1 person. If R is 1.2, every person who has coronavirus passes it on to 1.2 persons. Obviously, these are averages. You can't pass on coronavirus to 0.2 of a person. And they're saying that government strategy will be driven by the necessity to keep R below 1 to stop exponential growth, which presumably will mean that our NHS won't get overwhelmed. And that we won't get a second peak. That part of the strategy has been relatively uncontroversial. I don't think there's anyone at this point in government who's saying we're happy for R to get over 1. There are still differences, though, as we've been talking about on this show, between what you might think of as a Sweden strategy, which is have enough social distancing to keep R below 1, but ultimately let it move through the population just at a steady rate, and the South Korea strategy, which, as you say, let's suppress the virus, get R almost down to 0, get the reproduction rate almost down to 0 so that you have very, very few cases, and then aggressively track and trace so that those very few cases never increases to become a significant level. There was an interesting article in The Spectator today by James Forsyth, which was suggesting that Boris Johnson falls on the South Korea side of this dichotomy. I just want to go to a quote from that. So this is his explanation of what Boris Johnson's plan is. He says, put simply, It is to drive the coronavirus transmission rate, the reproduction number, or R, which shows the expected number of infections directly generated by one case, down as low as possible and then stay on top of it through a track, trace, and test approach. In other words, the government is going to go South Korean on the virus. The piece also says that this is putting him at odds with other people within his party. As we says, given that Tory MPs want to see a substantial relaxation of it, the lockdown, as do most of the cabinet, it will take all of Johnson's skills as a communicator to persuade his party to accept a slower timetable. Now, I'm never sure what to think when I read articles like this, because obviously that's a framing that Boris Johnson is going to love. The idea that Boris Johnson is pushing back against the people who want to put the economy before our health. And he is there standing up and saying, no, I want to defeat this virus altogether. It's a bit like there was a briefing in Bloomberg, I think it was earlier in the week, saying that actually what Dominic Cummings had been doing in those SAGE meetings of scientific experts was to say, it's necessary for us to have a lockdown now. You know, people like to encourage their allies to brief that they were doing the right thing in the meeting that made them seem like a hero. But at the same time, I mean, the fact that he is briefing this suggests that the government are potentially adopting more of an ambitious exit strategy than they might otherwise have done. If they go for the South Korean strategy, I think that would be a good thing. I want to go for one more nugget of information from this piece before I go to Aaron. So another thing they mentioned in terms of measuring R, because obviously you only know what R is, the reproduction rate of coronavirus, if you know how many people have coronavirus at any one time. They also mentioned it at the press conference today. The Office for National Statistics are starting to do random tests. Tests of random samples of the population, not a random test, to find out how widespread the virus is at any one time. Test 1,000 people, you work out if 1% or 2% of them have coronavirus. And they're hoping that if you test enough people, you can have a localized response to work out how strict any lockdown or how loose any relaxation can be. Let's go to this graphic. So if Bristol became a virus hotspot, testing could begin on a large scale and an army of contract tracers could be deployed until the outbreak was contained. Schools and non-essential retail in Bristol could be closed while the rest of the country continued as normal. Poses some interesting questions. I don't know if that would mean they'd close off all travel to Bristol when you'd put a big roadblock in the middle of the motorway that connects Bristol to the rest of the country. What do you make of all of this, Aaron? I mean, the noises that are coming from Boris Johnson aren't bad, really, on the question of the exit strategy.
I mean, maybe it's worth reading James Forsyth on this stuff, but his wife Allegra Stratton is now the new advisor to Rishi Sunak. There's a bit of a conflict of interest there, isn't there? So, who told him? Was it a bit of pillow talk?
Well, as I say, this is something that Boris Johnson would like. This is probably one of Boris Johnson's top advisors saying, "Can you write this because this is what we want you to think." Boris Johnson is thinking.
Yeah, but again, it's about delimiting communicate. They know it's a good thing to say as a communication strategy, but it's one thing to say, "Oh yeah, this sounds good. People want to hear this," and it's another thing to actually execute that strategy or having any intent. Everything exists in this kind of like communicative plane of like rhetoric. Or if we say the right things, that's the solution. No, the solution is literally having public policy responses which minimize contagion. It's not about what you're briefing to the press. I find it hard to believe this is going to be the strategy or that they'll be able to execute it. Just for the simple reason is it's so at odds with the core demands of the Tory party base, their donors, their MPs. And like you say, what would that? I presume any kind of regional lockdown would look a bit like what Italy's just gone through with its northeast, with around Veneto and Lombardy.
Well, they tried to do it and it actually fucked up massively. So they tried to do a Lombardy-only lockdown, and then everyone travelled to Rome.
Well, yeah, it fucked up because
before the lockdown was implemented.
It fucked up because the Lega leaked it to the press, and then everybody got out of Lombardy as quickly as possible. But I mean, you could see that being a potential strategy. But then, what are you going to do about people travelling into the UK from Wuhan, from northern Italy, from Spain, from France? Would you have restrictions on travel? We've had some people say, "Oh, you shouldn't close the borders." We're not suggesting you close all the borders, but clearly it's going to be one major means by which the virus would return at scale back into the UK potentially.
You have a 14-day quarantine. It's like no one's saying no one should be able to move from one country to another, but you should have a 14-day quarantine if someone does do that.
Yeah,
or you have a testing system which can pick it up early.
But most UK travel is, okay, if I'm flying business class from Frankfurt to London for a 2-day trip, I mean,
Just Skype.
How does quarantine work? Well, of course, no, I know, but again, from the Tory business perspective, that's friction that they don't want. So again, I find it kind of odd. And again, you have to think about Brexit too. If they're trying to navigate a no deal or a minimal deal come December 31st, it suits them to have a really, really extensive, harsh lockdown. It's popular and it'll make delivering Brexit a lot easier. However, as already said, I think they'd rather have a couple of 100,000 people die and bump up GDP a few points.
I mean, I think the thing we have to be really careful to watch out for is that they're not trying to deliver Sweden, but present it as South Korea.
Yeah.
Because I mean, that would be a very Boris Johnson thing to do. So sort of say, ultimately what we're going to do is slowly have herd immunity. Because unless you have a really severe lockdown, which gets transmission down to close to zero, which he hasn't suggested he's up for, then you are looking at something like a kind of Sweden strategy. So if he's offering Sweden and dressing it up as South Korea, that's something we should be worried about. But I mean, obviously, nothing wrong with giving him the benefit of the doubt for let's see, hold his feet to the fire, which is something that the leader of the opposition is not doing. So Keir Starmer, in response to this announcement, actually a bit similarly to what Corbyn was sometimes doing before before Starmer replaced him, is he claimed victory when Johnson announced that he would be, so that's an important piece of context. Also, what Boris Johnson said is he'll be publishing his exit strategy next week. This is Keir Starmer's response.
I've been calling on the Prime Minister to have a plan for the next stage, an exit strategy. We've been pushing hard on that in the last week or two. The Prime Minister's now said he's going to have a plan next week. So I think that shows that we were right to challenge on it, and I'm pleased that we're going to see a plan. We'll look at it when we see it, but it's a step in the right direction.
My favourite line there is, we'll look at it when we see it. Like, come on, like what's your... It just seems like such a... And I tweet some nice things about Keir Starmer every now and again. The first PMQs he did last week was very good. But here it's so transparent that what he's done is call for something which is totally uncontroversial, which everyone knew was going to happen. Obviously, there was going to have to be a plan to get out of lockdown at some point. So he said, well, there's going to have to be a plan to come out of lockdown. So I'll call for a plan. And then when the plan is announced, I'll say that's a success. It's like calling for the opposition party to write a budget and then claiming that it's a victory when they actually publish a budget. Like, what you're supposed to have an opinion on if you're a politician is what should be in the budget and what should be in the plan. I'll look at it when I see it. It doesn't make, you need to have some content in your opposition. It's not even that you need to be more disdainful or aggressive. I think when it comes to sort of left critiques of Keir Starmer, it's often said that, what you want is for him to stand up and rally the troops and say the Tories are killing people. Yeah. And some people are saying that, but that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying if you want to be an opposition that holds to the government to account, you have to say things of substance. You can't say, I want you to publish a plan without having any suggestion of what your plan would be, because it makes you just look completely impotent.
Yeah. And I actually understand the impulse which says we want to put a few months distance between us and Corbyn. We want the public to have a very different impression of Labour. We don't want to be seen as playing politics. I get all that. I don't necessarily agree with it line for line, but I think it's a reasonable disposition to the problem. But then you see how that's executed, like congratulating Dominic Raab at PMQs yesterday, like actually congratulating him. What do you think the Tories' Facebook adverts are going to be at the local elections in May when we talk about coronavirus? And let's say 200,000 people have died. Well, Keir Starmer was congratulating people. Labour didn't do any different. It just seems so unnecessary. I don't see what you get out of that. Or here is another example. Is it good enough? No. One sort of countervailing argument would be he hasn't got his team together yet. Lotto, the leader of the opposition's office, many hires haven't yet happened. He hasn't got a chief economic advisor. What is Keir Starmer? I said it on the burner last week. What is Keir Starmer's views on the deficit, on inflation? He probably doesn't have them because he hasn't got that chief economic advisor yet. So there's a little bit of sort of flying blind right now. But I agree with you, Michael. It's kind of pointless. I mean, it's just, and then I saw something else in The Guardian today where Keir Starmer said, actually, I don't think the spike in racist attacks after Brexit were because of Brexit. So you were saying something completely different 18 months ago. And I think the comparisons to Blair are really unfair to Tony Blair. Tony
Alistair
Blair was.
Campbell actually did a good piece on the differences between Keir Starmer and.
Oh, I haven't read that.
It was in The Guardian last week.
Alistair Campbell was, again, obviously, I can never forgive Alistair Campbell for how he behaved in regards to the Iraq War. I think that Alistair Campbell and several other people close to Tony Blair misled not just the public and Parliament, but literally Cabinet. This is the guy who signed a copy of the Hutton report for a fundraiser. This is crazy. If somebody died, there was an inquiry, and then you sign a copy of it. I mean, so I don't like the guy, but the facts are in the mid to late 1990s, when New Labour really belted the Tories left, right, and centre, particularly over the exchange rate mechanism crisis, the ERM crisis, and a bunch of other crises, they were a class apart. They were very, very good at what they did. Now, I didn't necessarily agree with the political content of what they were doing, but they weren't doing this. And I see what Keir Starmer is saying on this issue, for instance. I can't imagine Tony Blair or Robin Kirk or John Prescott or Gordon Brown, maybe Gordon Brown, he might have overthought it, but I can't imagine John Prescott, Robin Kirk, Tony Blair, or even a Margaret Beckett being like this. I think they would have trod a slightly better path. And so it's early days. He's only been a politician for 5 years. But it just strikes me he doesn't really want to be a politician. He wants to be a public. He wants to be a public administrator. He wants to be in high office. But you're the opposition. You actually have to make political arguments. You have to win the confidence of the public. And maybe he's going to struggle in that particular role. Maybe in government he might be much better. I think he probably would be. But this is a very unique role where, looking at his history, looking at his skills, looking at his personality type, he's going to have to change, and quite quickly, I think.
We're going to move on to a real issue of substance when it comes to how Keir Starmer will govern the Labour Party. First of all, I just wanted to prove that we hadn't picked a video of Keir Starmer which was out of context and where he looked particularly bad. Everything he said in that video, he was so proud of, they made it into an official Labour Party graphic. I just want to get up this tweet. I'm pleased to hear the Prime Minister promised a plan for the next stage and the exit strategy that we have been pushing for. We'll look at it when we see it, but it's a step in the right direction. Come on, Keir, wake up. Anyway, on to the issue of substance, which is Keir Starmer.
Can I be a pain in the ass? Because you just showed the shareable. There was, if you go through the Labour press team, who I follow on Twitter, there was somebody from the Shadow Front team was talking in the House of Commons, and they'd literally taken a photo with their phone. It wasn't even like a screenshot. Somebody taken a photo of the TV with their phone and then tweeted it with some copy. And you think, is this really a 21st century press operation that can take on the Tories? Suspect probably isn't.
Give them time. Give them time.
Give them time. Backward step.
An issue of substance, Keir Starmer. Well, to be honest, actually, the exit strategy is a substance. Anyway, an issue about foreign policy, Keir Starmer and Kashmir. So when Starmer was first elected leader of the Labour Party, he said his number one priority was to repair relationships with the Jewish community. There was also, another difficult issue that had caused some problems to the last Labour leadership in at least the 2019 general election, which was relationships with big bodies of the Hindu Indian community. It was sort of reported from lots of often marginal constituencies. So, for example, East Harrow, where I went around, that there were many people who were of Hindu Indian origin who were traditional Labour voters who weren't voting Labour this time. And that was because of their position on Kashmir. The background here is when tensions arose last summer, and that was in response to, that was because Narendra Modi had basically suspended the autonomy of Kashmir, which had been historically guaranteed, locked down that region from having any contact with the outside world, sent in the military, some real, nasty human rights abuses from a really nasty leader. At Labour Party conference, there was an emergency motion passed to condemn these actions, but it also committed the Labour Party to accept that Kashmir is a disputed territory and the people of Kashmir should be given the right of self-determination in accordance with UN resolutions. That was seen by some people to be anti-Indian and caused some of those problems on the doorstep this morning. Keir Starmer, so in a bid to solve this problem, met with Labour Friends of India and, brought about a real reverse of Labour policy. Let's go to a statement that he made after that meeting. So he says, we must not allow issues of the subcontinent to divide communities here. Fair enough. Any constitutional any constitutional issues in India are a matter for the Indian Parliament, and Kashmir is a bilateral issue for India and Pakistan to resolve peacefully. Labour is an internationalist party and stands for the defence of human rights everywhere. Now, you know, the difference between those statements is very clear. One talks about the right to self-determination, the other drops that. But I mean, the most controversial thing here is it's not even a statement that sits on the fence. You know, it's not saying that Labour will try and bring people together and talk to all sides in this conflict. It's taking a very strong position and a very strong pro-Modi position, which is that the constitutional settlement for Kashmir will be decided in the Indian Parliament, which, you know, is a very odd understanding of how you defend minorities. Is to say, oh, well, it'll be decided in a parliament where the majority wants to occupy and remove the autonomy of Kashmir. I mean, to me, it was a very right-wing statement, wasn't it, Aaron?
Yeah, it was phenomenally right-wing. I understand. Again, often if people criticize Starmer, people go, "Oh, this is the left." You know, get real. This isn't, you know, Jeremy Corbyn being the leader anymore. But it was a really odd, incoherent statement. Maybe we can actually pull it back up, and I'll just go through an inconsistency you literally see between the two lines. It says, on the one hand, you can see here, Kashmir is a bilateral issue for India and Pakistan to resolve peacefully. And then it says, literally the next sentence, Labour is an internationalist party and stands to the defence of human rights everywhere. Now, human rights are covered under international law. And yet you're saying in the previous sentence that this is an issue which is to be determined by India and Pakistan bilaterally, i.e. between them as two sovereign nations. So either this is an issue within the constraints of international human law, which it is, by the way, as is issues surrounding self-determination, or it's purely an issue between two sovereign powers, i.e. India and Pakistan. It can't be both of those things. Clearly, obviously, any debate around international law and human rights, there's always a tension between the international system of sovereign states and international law or something which obviously binds them. Often it doesn't actually. The more powerful you are, the less you tend to listen to it. But it doesn't make sense. It's incoherent. It's like saying that Crimea is an issue between Ukraine and Russia as two sovereign states. Who says that? No, you would say, we, as an international community, we respect the sovereignty of nations. That's the first thing. So you'd say, well, Russia shouldn't be going in there. But then if you had a legitimate referendum there, as you had for instance, in Kosovo, the majority of people in Kosovo wanted an independent nation state, which eventually broke away from the former Yugoslavia. You say, well, these people have a right to self-determination. And yet this entire corpus of international law, this guy's a human rights lawyer, has just been jettisoned. It's added on as like a little kind of garnish at the end. Of course, we're an international party, we respect human rights law. We've just said it's purely a bilateral issue between two sovereign states. So obviously you don't think that. And it's like, if you take human rights seriously, it has to inform policy. It's not just a garnish. It's not just a sort of a superficial thing you put on top. It's not some icing on the cake. It should be at the heart of the policy. Really, it surprised me because Starmer's a human rights lawyer. This is a guy who's been campaigning for years and years and years to end the death penalty in various countries around the world. You know, I would have thought on an issue like this, he'd actually be very good, which leads me to suspect he didn't write this, or, you know, the policy isn't necessarily his. I think something that right wing probably has come from somebody in his office who has quite different politics. I don't know, because it just showed a complete disinterest in ideas of universality and human rights and the universal right to self-determination. Really shocking to see it.
I mean, you're totally right about the inconsistency there, because he says he's talking about internationalism, but what he's done there is a really traditional realist response to international relations, which is basically say what happens in that nation is their issue. And also, basically, I mean, later in the letter, he talks about how we're going to strengthen trade with India, etc. You don't want to upset the sovereign government of India. So what they do with their minority communities, that's up to them. Right? That's a realist position. It's not an internationalist position. So it is disappointing. And I have to say, I mean, because one thing I thought Keir Starmer would potentially be quite good at, especially in, you know, contradiction to someone like Tony Blair, is he does, well, I assumed he was someone who sort of cared about human rights and potentially about international relations. We've often said that he doesn't seem to have a very strong position when it comes to political economy, but that's fine if what his passion is about defending human rights. And that's an important obsession of a Labour leader. But if you look at this letter, which is one of his first moves, really, as Labour leader, one of his first concrete policy stances he's taken, it runs completely roughshod over the human rights of the Kashmiri people. So, I mean, I hope you're right in that it's just some, lowly advisor, and Keir Starmer will change tack here. And that's not necessarily even to say that he has to commit to the previous Labour policy. I think the idea that for Labour to say we stand 100% in terms of self-determination for Kashmir, I mean, they haven't said that about Catalonia, for example.
Yeah.
You can have a more sort of almost wishy-washy statement where you sort of like, we respect the rights of the people of Kashmir to determine, et cetera, but we also recognize the claims of India, blah, blah, blah. You know what I mean? You can have a sort of wishy-washy one, but this isn't wishy-washy. This is coming down very concretely on the side of the Modi government.
Yeah, this is not fence sitting. If fence sitting has its place in politics, ultimately the argument could be made this isn't going to be the policy. It's just, it's to placate a certain interest group. By the way, Labour Friends of India aren't even affiliated to the Labour Party, which I just find absolutely remarkable. And this press release earlier on today saying we have to regain the trust of British Indians. I mean, BAME communities just voted in 2 elections in overwhelming numbers for the Labour Party. Labour's strongest vote in this country is BAME voters. And of course, you have to delimit various communities. But I have met very few people from South Asia saying I'm not voting for Labour because of this issue. And I'm sure, well, I know for a fact it was a major issue in several seats. But regain the trust, and it's just the way it's said. It's been said in regards to British Jewish community. Understandably, there's a huge issue there, but it's just the way it's just kind of cut, copy, paste onto this issue. I was like, this isn't the same thing, and it just seems so politically unstrategic and tactless, as well as the policy itself being inastute and I think just plain wrong, and actually just plain at odds with the best bits of Labour foreign policy over the last 30 years. Even if you're, again, Blair was a liberal interventionist, right? Blair would say we should go to Kosovo, we should go to Sierra Leone, heaven forbid, we should go to Iraq and Afghanistan because we believe in these universal rights. I think that's a terrible way to conduct foreign policy, but that was how he did things. But this idea that, oh well, look, you can oppress this minority and it's purely about bilateral relations, and then you have the temerity to say at the end, well, actually, we're internationalists, we care about human rights law. Well, you patently don't. The substantive content of that declaration is no different to what Donald Trump would say. And I'm not saying that to be facetious. Clearly, Keir Starmer is a much more progressive, intelligent political operator than Donald Trump. But in content, the policy is no different. And that has to be really concerning because, like you say, it's one of the first sort of foreign policy tests. And if you're coming down on the side of Modi, confronted with that first test, just to placate a small group of people who aren't even affiliated to the party, you have to worry, how much backbone has this guy got to stand up for something which he believes in as a politician? And we haven't seen it. And it's something we talked about previously. He was director of public prosecutions. We've had a sort of an audition for a guy being in an incredibly important national role where he'd be scrutinized in a way that almost nobody will ever understand. As director of public prosecutions, how many risks did he take? How many big calls did he take and push back against perhaps the received wisdom? None. This clearly is just taking the easy route for the sake of placating somebody for the short term. And actually, in politics, that rarely works, particularly on the left. You're going to need a big strategic vision. Okay, foreign policy isn't the most important pressing issue right now, but it's going to be a big one. And more missteps like that, and he's going to lose a lot of his base.
We're going to wrap up there, Aaron Bastani. It's been a pleasure. You've been watching Tiskisau. You've been watching Novara Media. Please share the link, like the show, and go to novaramedia.com/support to donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month or give us a coronavirus lockdown bonus. I've been Michael Walker. We've been Novara Media. Good night.